Stuart Whitten leads the team researching markets, incentive and institutions, and does lots of work around the country and has over a number of years in the research area of market-based instruments and other incentive programs. And we've asked Stuart to come along today and talk to us a bit about integrating the use of MBIs and other NRM practices, so to look a bit more broadly at the policy perspective from his experience in this area. Thanks, Stuart.
Thanks, Patrick. I guess the reason I wanted to speak about this is it's probably now time to think again about how you integrate your MBIs or market-oriented approaches with other NRM tools. And it's a problem that myself and a couple of my colleagues have been thinking about for a few years. We haven't done a lot about it. So it was a good excuse to try and tighten up our thinking in this area a bit more. Our motivating... Oh, I get two cover slides. I like this one better. Our motivating question is, what role should markets play? Fairly obvious, that's the standard same old, same old. But more importantly, where do you mix them with other approaches and where to avoid? And I found a nice new word here, which I won't use again today, I promise, but it's going to look good in a journal article when I write it up. Miscability. Mixability, apparently it's spelt like that, and it's a real word. Simple as that. Sorry, were you hoping there was a better story? Sorry, I'll find a better one later. Okay. Perhaps an illustrative example of what I'm talking about. If we're thinking about biodiversity conservation, particularly if we're thinking about conserving a threatened ecological community, we're going to need to look at a range of actions across locations. Those actions are going to differ across scales. And the ecological possibilities and limitations are going to vary as well. So you're going to get a different payoff from different actions in different part of the landscape. And not only that, you're going to have various landholders. You may have private, public, Indigenous, NGOs and others. They're going to have different motivations, conservation, profit, stewardship, so on and so forth. And they're going to have differing costs, benefits, abilities and constraints. So it would be naive to think that one instrument, well applied, would deliver you an outcome in that type of context. So how might you address this? We've come up with 7 broad principles that we think offer a useful starting point for how you might address this problem. And I'm going to go through each of these in turn and I guess try to give a bit of an example and a little bit of the context and depth to what we're talking about. The first one is that you want to design your instruments to match net benefits. There's no good going out and paying a lot of money with little biodiversity benefit, for example. We don't really want to pay for outcomes where there are private incentives to deliver those same outcomes, so where the private benefit is commensurate with the public benefit. And there's some occasions where we don't want to pay for benefit at all, and that's where your public cost is greater than your private benefit. We just simply don't want those actions to happen in the landscape. And just as an illustration, you'll find 3 broad forms of MBI prevalent in the 2 boxes that I've highlighted there. You tend to get payment-based instruments where your public benefits are much larger than your private costs. So this is where you're investing in particular environmental assets in the landscape. You tend to get quantity-based MBIs where your private benefit is a little bit larger than your public cost. Particular offsets are the sort of tool that you'll often see there. And you'll seem to get market friction MBIs where the market is able to provide some incentives, so there are private benefits. You don't tend to... Market friction MBIs aren't terribly useful where there's no private benefit at all because they're simply designed to support existing markets. But you can see that there are a range of other instruments that you want to use in your landscape where, for example, you've got a public cost which is greater than the private benefit. For example, you may wish to use a regulatory approach there. and where the private cost is only a little bit greater than the public benefit, you might want to look at technology change or other ways of reducing either the public cost or increasing the public benefit, depending on what you're looking at there. Sorry, I'll just jump back up. The second principle that we're looking at is managing the instrument cost to all parties for each and in aggregate. This might seem like something that's obvious, but it's very rarely done. Economists would tend to call some of these costs transaction costs, but it's also your basic administration costs and so on. There are sort of three broad elements that you want to look at here. We do need to learn about the cost per benefit unit. It's no good going out there, as I said before, and paying a lot of money for little benefit. Now, I don't mean here that you want to have a fine-tuned accounting spreadsheet that you can submit for auditing. You may just need to do this approximately, but it's really important that you think about where you're allocating your scarce resources. Second, you want to take care that the costs to others are commensurate with the benefits. There's no good having a cheap, flashy instrument if it costs a lot for landholders to engage with it. And obviously, you look for opportunities to reduce costs, so continuous innovation through time. There are three areas where we think that designing an instrument relevant to the biophysical scale is important. First of all, the threats and the ecological processes take place at different scales, so you might need to match different instruments across those scales. And here you can see a range of ecological threats and the range of scales that they apply at. So, for example, climate change is off the scale. It's a really big thing. So if you're targeting paddock change to achieve a real measurable reduction in climate change, you might have a slight problem there. Whereas livestock grazing, it's pretty much managed by fences. So managing that at a paddock scale is completely appropriate. The second area that you might want to think about is targeting your instrument relevant to what you want to happen in the landscape. So you can see here some of this comes from the environmental stewardship program, some of this comes from the impending National Wildlife Corridors initiative, but basically what you're looking at here is a range of different activities in different parts of your landscape, and again a single instrument isn't going to get you there. So you need to think about what instruments will best achieve that mix of outcomes across your landscape. And thirdly, you need to think about the relevant biophysical outcome that you're trying to achieve. And you can already see that the Victorians do this quite well. They've got an offset program dealing with maintaining a cap level, and then you've got purchase and support schemes which are designed in principle to raise the level of provision above that level. 4, you'll need to adapt or diversify to meet participant needs. Now, I've got 2 examples here. First of all, there may be opportunities where you're not working directly with landholders. Sorry, that's the wrong way of putting that. There may be opportunities where you're not paying landholders directly. So Terrain, for example, has a program where all they're negotiating with landholders is access. They're actually paying a private contractor to coordinate actions across multiple land holdings to try and manage feral pig control. So they're managing it at the relevant scale. They're managing their costs by engaging directly with the contractor rather than with a whole bunch of different landholders. And many of these landholders actually wouldn't be very good at this, even if they did contract them, because there's a whole lot of lifestyle type landholders there. And the sort of pig control program they're working on requires some reasonably specialised skills, so that works well for them. The second one is offset market design. If you go and have a look at Bushbroker in Victoria, it's a very good example of this. Their entry portal lists a number of different entry points for a range of diverse participants. So you've got a search facility for people who directly need to engage looking for offsets. Small traders can enter over the counter. Then they've got other entry points for other players in that market. Our 5th principle is looking at risk and uncertainty in design. Now, there's kind of 2 countervailing things going on here. On the one hand, if you've got a good portfolio of instruments, you're reducing risk. So it's the same principles in a financial market. You can target different outcomes in different parts of the landscape. You can target different actors. They'll have different risks. Yes, of course, they're going to be at least partly coordinated because you're operating in a single landscape that has a range of threats across it. But nevertheless, you get some of those benefits. On the other side of it, though, you will get some risks that are actually introduced by having a portfolio of instruments. And they come in two dimensions, if you like. On one dimension, while I've talked in a nice world where you can optimise your bundle of instruments, that's not true in the landscape. Usually you'll have a bunch of different players who are putting in different instruments with overlapping goals and objectives. So there's risk introduced in playing in that environment. You don't really know what your competitors, collaborators, or whatever you might want to call them at the time are going to do next. You might have some idea, but your fancy new idea might be gazumped and so on. The more obvious risks, though, are things like duplication within an organisation, multiple fixed costs, particularly every time you do a new instrument, you've got a bunch of design and implementation costs that are repeated. It's pretty hard to share those very well. And complexity. You know, if you get it wrong, you're going to end up with a bunch of confused landholders that don't really know where they should be going next. And we've got two more principles, and then I'm going to go through a sort of conceptual example. Flexibility is an asset and patience may be a virtue. So we know that there are knowledge, resource and operational constraints. This suggests an adaptive approach which will allow for learning through time, responds to the unexpected and uncontrolled, allows you to adjust individual instruments and which instruments are being applied in a landscape, and it recognises the value of future options. And in particular, you're looking at identifying where you need to act now, where you can wait, what you will gain or cost by waiting, and prioritising in that way. But patience is also required, particularly because, and again there's multiple dimensions to this, particularly because we don't know enough sometimes to design an effective instrument, so we might have a sort of halfway stopgap instrument while we gather more information, but also because the results of actions often take quite a while to be observed. So there's a need for patience to observe sometimes how effective your instrument is before you go jumping in and putting more and more things into play. And finally, because opportunities change over time. So some patient people have been waiting for a long time for a biodiverse carbon market, and they might be very happy now. But I'm sorry to say, I think they're going to have to wait a little bit longer. At least now they might be able to see the sun rising over the horizon, though. Good. Lastly, avoid perverse interactions but encourage synergies. Again, fairly obvious, but I guess the first thing I want to note here is that not all interactions between instruments are perverse. So, if you've got two markets out there, they're going to influence the prices in each of them. That's obvious. It's not really a problem. We're not too worried if the price of Italian bread influences the price of other bread. That's just what happens out in the real world. There's nothing perverse about that. But when it starts to become associated with things like damaging behaviour, so if you're incentivising people to destroy native grasslands in order to plant biodiverse carbon forests, you've got a problem. If you're if you're allowing significant leakage, so this is where you repair a paddock here, but this one over here gets torn up, you've got a problem. If you're crowding out private actions, you may have a problem. And there will be others. So particularly the perverse interaction space is something to be fairly careful of and keep a good eye on what's actually happening in your landscape. Just before I move into the example, in terms of encouraging synergies, you need to look at where multiple outcomes can create a bundle incentive that's positive, but be careful not to take options away. And Eliza illustrated that very well this morning when she talked about the offset example. And I'll move into the example now, but there are a few other points in the paper. So how might this work in practice? Now, if you think about this as a sort of a landscape, I've got mine nice and uniformly distributed. That mightn't be the case in a real landscape, but we'll work with that. If you run an MBI, so a conservation tender, you'll get some of the guys up to the left of your price line. You won't get all of them because not all of them will enter, and your budget will probably be limited. I hope you can all see that. So an information extension campaign will get some more, but it'll really only get those ones with low cost of change. And sorry, just in case you can't see, this is your landholder cost of delivery to benefit. This is a magic index of environmental benefits up on the left. If we regulate, say, some duty of care, we'll force some improvement. Of course, we've got to assume that they're monitored and actually do it. But only where the environmental benefits are below an acceptable level. And remember that it might be very expensive for some of your participants, i.e. these guys out here. And it mightn't be worthwhile. You're not getting much environmental benefit from them anyway. Targeted purchase or similar can be useful for some of the cream that you're not getting otherwise. So just to wrap up, what you want to decide is which instruments to mix and which instruments to ditch. And the sort of things you want to be thinking about there is who's your target population and what do you need them to do. They might not be as uniform as that lovely conceptual example where mine is spread everywhere so I can get 4 or 5 instruments in. They might be strongly correlated. So you might actually be only looking at a couple of well-targeted instruments. What are their capabilities? What are their resources? What are their interests? What are the barriers and what are the opportunities that you get out of that? Do you need to sequence your instruments? Do they actually know what you want them to do? So you might not need to just have a bunch of instruments in your landscape. You might actually want to have a differing mix of instruments through time. What other initiatives are in place or proposed? Where are the gaps? Where are the opportunities there? And finally, it's probably important to use a strategic investment analysis approach in thinking about this. So it's not that you need a high-tech approach, but rather this needs some serious thought, and it should be done over time with an opportunity to reflect on market opportunities, taking into account data wherever from multiple sources as you can identify it and bundle it together. And I haven't got a slide here, but there is one in the CD which sort of gives a very loose outline of that, and it's another area that myself and my team have been thinking about how to develop processes for thinking through on ground what sort of instruments are needed and how effective they're likely to be. Thank you.